Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today will be a continuation from yesterday, wherein we talked about the Mauryas. And friends, as I mentioned already, this is going to be part 2 of that series. And friends, for this lecture and discussion, we have amongst us our subject expert, Dr. Shankar Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Hindu College, University of Delhi. And with this very brief introduction, I welcome Sir to the studio. Sir, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Urvashi, and good afternoon, viewers. This is in continuation to what we had discussed yesterday, and therefore, let me just briefly touch upon what we all covered in our interaction yesterday. We spoke about the Mauryan sources. When we say sources, what we mean is the tools and methods and also the facts, literary plus archaeological, with the help of which historians have been able to reconstruct the narrative of Mauryan period. So we spoke about different literary sources, Kautilya's Arthashastra, Megasthenes' Indica. We also spoke of Ashoka's edicts in terms of archaeological sources. We also spoke about the coins, which continued to be used ever since 600 BC in North India, which were punchmark coins, probably issued by the trade guilds and not by the state. We also spoke of, perhaps this was not taken up for discussion yesterday, but archaeological sources also include what we know as painted grey ware culture and also northern black polished ware culture. Of course, we shall briefly be talking about it just to ensure that there is full coverage of the sources in today's discussion. But primarily, the focus of today's discussion would be on the analytics and basically as to how the reconstructed history of Mauryas should be pertinent to us in 21st century. And when we look at the pertinence of the discussion around the Mauryas to us, what I mean here is some kind of a discussion that happens amongst historians. As part of historiography, it keeps happening in every phase of history, and in future also the focus will keep shifting depending on the agenda that the contemporary society offers with respect to our study of past. So historians for the last 30 years or so have been very actively engaged in understanding whether our knowledge about Mauryan rule or nature of the state itself should be shaped shaped by the narrative produced by Kautilya's Arthashastra primarily, which results into some kind of a view where the Mauryan Empire appears to be extremely centralized. On the other hand, in the last 30 years, as I said, historians have started re-looking at this proposition, and several historians like Fussman and Mabet and several other Indian scholars also, noticeably B.D. Chattopadhyay, etc., they have started giving credence to the idea of Mauryan Empire not being that centralized. Rather, they have been talking of the decentralizing elements present in the Mauryan Empire or present in the Mauryan rule. And that is what we shall be looking at after briefly talking about the leftover portion of the sources which we could not cover in yesterday's discussion. So that is going to be the chief focus of today's discussion, and towards the end, if we are left over with time, we shall try to also look at some major points informing the debate around the decline of the Mauryan Empire. Now, having spoken about the general format in which our interaction will proceed, let's now speak of the leftover portions of yesterday's discussion in terms of sources. As we said that we had covered the literary sources available to us for the Mauryan times, including the Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical sources coming from Jatakas and Jaina sources, and also Deepavansha, Mahavans, etc., which are Buddhist sources coming from Sri Lanka and so forth. We spoke of the fact that the inscriptional reference to Ashok, which is which does not name him as Ashok, rather it only informs us about a term called Devanam Piyadasi Raja. So this word is connected to the historical personality of Ashok with reference to its corroboration with what is available in Sri Lankan Buddhist chronicles. So that is something which also helps us emphasize the significance of multiplicity of sources present for a particular period of time. When a historian has, or when historians have luxury of having multiple sources, or sources coming from, or sources of different genre. For example, some from Buddhist sources, some from Brahmanical sources, some archaeological in nature, some literary in nature, and so forth. Then it becomes easy to arrive at a more realistic picture of the times that we are probing or studying, and that is precisely the case that happens with the onset of the Mauryan Empire. Certainly we are flooded with several sources which were so hard to come by in the preceding periods. Now there is something called the archaeological counterpart of the 150 years that we are talking of as Mauryan rule. So around 3rd century, around 4th century, 3rd century, or for that matter 2nd century BC, which is the period which had the Mauryan rule, historians have been able to identify specific layers in archaeological excavations, particularly in the northern part of India or the Gangetic belt, where we have definite evidence of Ashokan or for that matter Mauryan rule, and the stratum belonging to the Mauryan period of course gives us a fair bit of archaeological remains, and there are several archaeological cultures which are ascribed to this period. Now if we compare them with the preceding stratum in archaeological records in the vertical archaeological profile, of course the preceding period would be beneath the Ashokan or for that matter Mauryan layer, and so the layer that contains the material stratum of say 6th century BC onwards, and by the time it reaches 4th century, 3rd century BC, there is some kind of an advancement, particularly in the middle Gangetic plains, which was the nuclear area of the Mauryan Empire, and we shall be talking about it when we talk of the nature of the state, what we mean by nuclear core and so forth. So this area was the area of dense population, and the material stratum of this region appears to be comparatively richer with respect to the preceding layer, and there is a typical pottery that we come across. Of course, we start getting it from the preceding period also in this region. So there is some bit of we can say material prosperity which is attested through the archaeological excavations in the middle Gangetic plain from around 6th century BC itself, and Mauryans probably capitalized on it. and the fact that this was the nuclear area for them. Therefore, it rather helped them carving a big empire springing from the middle Gangetic plains. So, while in other places we have painted grey ware culture, which is a specified pottery alongside several other artifacts, including iron artifacts and iron weapons and some agricultural implements also. In the painted grey ware phase, or in the region where painted grey ware culture is encountered, we find that the typical pottery belonging to painted northern black polished ware culture, which is the central part of the Gangetic belt. Here, the pottery is typically typically made of a better fabric, and the surface treatment is more, we can say, glazed, and as the name suggests, it's painted with black color, shining black color. So it has a glossy surface as compared to painted grey ware culture, which has a normal kind of paint over the burnt pottery, which is grey in color. Now, historians say that this pottery, for instance, R.S. Sharma tells us that this pottery probably is a deluxe pottery. Deluxe pottery would mean that it's a prized possession, and it is symptomatic of some kind of a material prosperity of the people using it. Also important is the fact that towards the later part of the Mauryan rule, towards the end of the Mauryan rule, when these potteries are encountered, they are at times, we get this evidence that probably people try to piece together the broken fragments of this pottery, which again meant that it must have been some kind of a prized possession, otherwise people would have discarded it and started using some other pottery. So, the point is that there is a semblance of material prosperity ascribed to this region, which was the springboard of Mauryan rule, which was the center of Mauryan rule, from where empire-like structure could be erected, and this gels well with the kind of description that we get in Kautilya's Arthashastra, or for that matter other sources, which do tell us that the state was always on the lookout for new sources of revenue, and there was this kind of a compulsion on Mauryan state to generate and garner more and more revenue. The policies were also framed in such a way, or at least sought to be framed in such a way, in case we regard the Kautilya's Arthashastra as a prescriptive text. So, the king was always on the lookout for an opportunity to send people to new areas where probably cultivation was not taking place, so that cultivation starts in those areas. This policy was referred to as Janapada Nivesh. So, deliberate settling of population in new areas, and initially, of course, the state would not bother these people by subjecting them to some kind of a revenue mechanism. So, initially they would be left free to fend for themselves and generate some bit of money for them. And from the state point of view, of course, over a long period of time, when that area gets fairly settled and cultivation becomes the order of the day, people settle there and engage in different pursuits, including trade, commerce, exchange, and so forth. Then at a later date, the state would probably come and start levying taxes or revenue. So that was the intent of the state, or that's the way things were, and this is the kind of picture that we get by reading Kautilya's Arthashastra. So, this is something which is important, and also there is something called the trail of northern black polished ware in areas which are beyond the Vindhyas, that is south of Vindhyas. And what we find is that northern black polished ware, which becomes a characteristic pottery of the central Gangetic plain, middle Gangetic plain, in the Mauryan period, we start getting these cultures, northern black polished ware cultures, in areas also south of Vindhyas. And that this again tells us that it was probably during this time, in the Mauryan time, that this culture, which originated in the northern part of India or the middle Gangetic plain, actually started moving in Deccan and beyond as well. And it is usually proposed that this culture, the state culture or the metropolitan culture, or empire-like culture or peasant society culture, Brahmanical culture carrying Brahmanical ethos, caste system, etc. All these are the trappings of the same culture, and it is proposed by some historians that it were the 3 M's, that is the merchants, monks and monarch, who actually became the bearers of all these cultural elements into areas south of Vindhyas. So, it is on their shoulder that these trappings, these cultural trappings actually travelled to areas south of Vindhyas. And of course, this is not to deny some kind of active role that the people in Deccan and South India must have played. So, as a result of some kind of a cross fertilization of ideas, cultures and coming together of different traditions, in this area also state societies started mushrooming in the post-Mauryan period. For example, outside the Gangetic belt, the first state which seems to have emerged south of Vindhyas is that of the Satvahans in Andhra area and in the Maharashtra area around 1st century BC. And this is immediately after the fall of the Mauryan Empire or disintegration of the Mauryan Empire. And that tells us that the Mauryan rule must have had some kind of a formative impact and role in taking these empire-like sensibilities and culture to places beyond the Vindhyas, so far as the subcontinental history of India is concerned. So, that is one, and we have already alluded to the policies, deliberate policies of kings making efforts to settle the uninhabited lands and so forth, which can be seen alongside these archaeological evidence that we have with relation to the Mauryan and the post-Mauryan period. So, having discussed about the sources and the succession of kings, which we of course spoke about yesterday, let us now come to the analysis of the kind of state that Mauryans must have had. If we look at the modern historiography, as we said yesterday, that it was around the beginning of 20th century that Kautilya's Arthashastra was discovered, and ever since there have been attempts to give a particular kind of narrative about the Mauryans. We also spoke of the struggle for Indian independence, which was already on around this time in the 1920s, 1930s and 1940s. And this is the time when Indian historians are in some kind of a political need to counter the British ideological frame in which they were trying to put India, and this was part of national struggle. It was the one can say ideological plane at which this struggle was fought, And there we find that more and more nationalist historians are trying to project the Mauryan phase of Indian history as empire-like phase, which is extremely centralized and which is very efficient, which is extremely bureaucratized, and which is of pan-Indian proportion, meaning thereby that the claim of the British that they were the first who brought this huge area, huge land mass of the subcontinent under one political structure was sought to be punctured by the nationalist historians by quoting the Kautilya's Arthashastra and by providing a counter narrative of the Mauryan Empire, where a native is ruling over a very large portion of the subcontinent, which definitely was more vast than the British India, because it included parts of Afghanistan, extended up to Iran area. So this narrative, this British narrative was countered by nationalist historians on the basis of what was now readily available in the 1920s, 30s and 40s from Kautilya's Arthashastra. And Kautilya's Arthashastra, as we discussed yesterday, gives a very detailed account of administration, revenue, political economy, policies, traits of the king, council of ministers, the way it should be, and so forth, types of land which should be captured by the kings, and the strategies, military strategies that should be adopted by the king, how alert he should remain, how the principle of meritocracy should be invoked in order to select the bureaucrats and so forth. So, by the standard of the contemporary period, that is the Mauryan period, it was a fairly advanced and sophisticated account that we have on political economy in the form of Kautilya's Arthashastra. So, in this context, in this political context of struggle for Indian independence and the need to counter the British narrative, there was some kind of a valorization, or we can say accentuation of the centralized character of Mauryan rule and bureaucratized character of Mauryan rule. So, whatever was described in Kautilya's Arthashastra or Megasthenes' Indica were uncritically used to produce this counter narrative of centralized bureaucratized empire under the Mauryas, and this tendency ran into the 1950s and 60s as well, even after independence, and that is how most of us are given to understand about the Mauryan rule as extremely centralized and bureaucratized. But from the 1980s onwards, later part of 1970s, 80s onwards, the alternative viewpoint also started emerging about the nature of the Mauryan state, and we have historians like Gerard Fussman, Trotman, we also have Mabbitt, and Indian historians like B.D. Chattopadhyay, etc. They started having some kind of a relook at the way Mauryans must have transacted their business, and also important in these set of scholars that I mentioned is a very sophisticated work by Romila Thapar also, who in her book on Ashoka and the decline of the Mauryan Empire started talking of the segregated or you can say segmented nature of Mauryan Empire, where she says that it's not proper to presume that an empire, an ancient empire of such a huge proportion could have existed in an undifferentiated circumstance, in an undifferentiated way. So what she says is that she looks at the historical changes that different areas under the empire must have undergone around that time. And she says that if we look at the peripheral part of Ashokan empire, so the Karnataka area or the Andhra area or the central Indian area, or for that matter the Afghanistan area, Pakistan, the northwestern part of the empire and so forth, bordering the Arabian Sea and so forth. So these around this time, around 4th century, 3rd century BC, these areas had not undergone the kind of transformation, historical transformation that the Middle Gangetic Plain or the Upper Gangetic Plain had undergone. And that's where she starts, that's where her proposition gains credence from. And she says that it would be better if we try to understand the Mauryan Empire as a huge area with differing historical or huge area at different stages of historical development, historical and social development. So she would say that the Magad area would be regarded as a metropolitan area, which is very much socialized with the idea of trade networks, transactions, coinage, agriculture, intensive agriculture, extensive usage of iron in agriculture and so forth, urbanized, and then around that area would be the core area, which is also fairly socialized with the idea of monarchical rule, and fair degree of agriculture is happening, not to the extent it is happening in the metropolitan zone or as densely populated as the metropolitan area. Nevertheless, core area is also very much in touch with the changes in historical and social terms which were happening in the metropolitan area. And then we have the peripheral part of the empire, which is far off, which is situated far off from the seat of power, which is Patliputra, the modern day Patna, and which was the capital of the Mauryas, which is the metropolitan area. And so the entire area, which for instance we talk of the iconic Kalinga War in the case of Ashok, and also important is the fact that if we ponder upon the issue, like who was Ashok fighting against, then we don't have a definite answer in terms of the king of Kalinga. So all we know that there was Kalinga War, but what was the kind of polity practiced before that Kalinga War in Kalinga in Orissa area, we don't have much information, and that tells us that it could be the case that the Brahmanical peasant society, which is very much the culture in Middle Gangetic Plain or the northern part of India, had perhaps not informed, had perhaps not become the order of the day in these areas, in Kalinga area or in the other peripheral areas. And that's where the catch is, that if we take this kind of a view, then it becomes very logical to understand from the royal policy point of view that the interest of the state, interest of the metropolitan state would also keep differing depending on the areas that we are talking of. So the interest of the metropolitan state from the metropolitan area would be different. Similarly, the interest of the state from the core area would be somewhat different from what it is in the case of metropolitan area, and similarly the interest of the state from the peripheral area would also be different from what it is in the core and nuclear area. So the point here is that suppose in Kautilya's Arthashastra we do get explicit reference to gold mining from Kolar area, which is in Karnataka, and hence technically in peripheral area as per Romila Thapar's categorization. Now, the Ashoka, the Mauryan ruler is interested in getting some bit of gold from Kolar area, which is rich in gold, and hence mining was done right from around this period. But who are the people that the Mauryan officials must be transacting with? Who are the people situated around Kolar area? What was their nature of polity? Was this polity also experiencing market economy, or were they or had they graduated to that stage of historical development where markets had flourished, or where coin was in use and so forth? If we think of these issues, then there is not much of an information that we have with reference to the polity, economy, and social development of the people living in the Karnataka area at around this point of time. So, we can safely presume that some kind of a rudimentary tribal polity could have been in place in these areas, and these are the people, this is the situation in which the Mauryan officials had to transact with these areas, and hence the Mauryan ruler would not permanently install some royal official in these areas, because that was not the requirement. So, the transactions could have been sporadic and not regular, as it was in the metropolitan and core area, and hence there was no need to restructure the administrative apparatus that existed in peripheral areas. So, in terms of the impact of Mauryan rule in peripheral areas, we can see the difference here as per Professor Thapar's proposition, that in peripheral areas it might not have led to that much of restructuring. And that is because the state's interest from peripheral areas was also limited and sporadic, and they had very limited way in which they were intervening, or they were getting into the affairs in the peripheral area. There was no deployment of permanent administration or army in these areas either. And if we take this viewpoint, then our understanding of the Mauryan polity or nature of the Mauryan state starts becoming little bit different from what it was in the nationalist phase, or what it was in the 1950s and 60s, which was extremely centralized, bureaucratized, with very organized army, bureaucracy, and the king in command, all political parts vested in the king, and the economy being regulated to the minutest of the details by the king himself through his officials, as are mentioned in Kautilya's Arthashastra. But as I said, that when such kinds of propositions started coming, historians also started trying to revisit the way in which we read Kautilya's Arthashastra, and that's where Mabbitt's propositions are also important, because he goes on to emphasize this. One is the ascribing of Kautilya's Arthashastra to this period, which is also a disputed proposition by some historians. But even if we concede that Kautilya's Arthashastra refers to the Mauryan period, historians now by and large speak of the Kautilya's Arthashastra being more prescriptive rather than descriptive. So, it is a kind of ideal type of administration, of monarchical administration. So, what Kautilya is probably writing in Arthashastra is the way it should be, and not necessarily the way it was. So, with this kind of a perspective, of course, the decentralized element or decentralized understanding of Mauryan Empire becomes all the more acceptable. And they again argue that for instance, if we look at Fussman's view, he talks of the archaic nature of transportation and communication, which must have existed in the Mauryan period. And for instance, he says, or we can very logically think of it, what must have been the fastest mode of overland transportation in the Mauryan period, then we can think of horse-driven chariots. And with this as the chief or the fastest mode of transportation, he says that to think of such a huge empire being governed from Pataliputra and areas as far as Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh being regulated on day-to-day basis by the king situated in Pataliputra appears to be not so realistic proposition. And therefore, he says that given the archaic nature of transportation and communication, it would not have been possible to have that kind of acute centralization as is claimed in the narratives of the nationalist historians and the narratives of 1950s and 60s. And on that basis, they go on to say that it must have taken this much of, they do a rough calculation, it must have taken this number of days, this number of months for the army to reach the farthest parts of the empire from Pataliputra, and therefore the level of centralization that we can think of must be to a minimal level, and we need to revise our understanding of Mauryan Empire as extremely centralized, because some decentralizing elements were innate in the archaic nature of technology itself, archaic nature of transportation and communication technology itself. So, all these arguments tend to give more and more space and scope for the local authorities or regional people to assert their own identity or their own role at the cost of what is being dictated from the Mauryan capital. So, this is the kind of historiographical issue which is very much live, and historians are taking sides with reference to the contours of this centralization decentralization debate concerning the Mauryan Empire even in the present times. And if this is how we need to understand the Mauryan Empire or nature of the Mauryan state, then of course we need to dilute the centralization or centralized quotient in the narrative, which comes out of some kind of an uncritical reading of Kautilya's Arthashastra and the nationalist fervor in which these narratives were produced in the initial decades of 20th century. So, that takes care of the issue of the nature of Mauryan state with reference to the debate around the centralization and decentralization. Now, let us also briefly touch upon the issue of the decline of Mauryan Empire, because this is also a contested issue, and in the nationalist phase when people were writing about the Mauryan times and trying to understand as to how such a hugely regulated empire disintegrated in such a short period of time, that is to say, after Ashoka's rule, it did not take more than 60-70 years for the Mauryan rule to come to an end. And the entire span of the Mauryan rule does not extend beyond 150 years or so. So, how is that if the empire was so formidable, then how come it was so short lived? Then in the nationalist writings, because yesterday we did talk of the fact that it wasn't only nationalism at work or struggle for Indian independence at work, but there was also communal flare up on account of the Muslim League politics and the counter viewpoint produced by Hindu nationalists also. So, it was in this situation that this issue was debated, and it was proposed that the fact that Mauryan empire was succeeded by Shungas and the Kanvas in northern part of India, and the fact that it was Pushyamitra Shung who was a Brahmin, but the military commander under the Mauryas who engineered some kind of a coup d'etat in the Mauryan army, and resultantly the Mauryan empire disintegrated, and smaller polities again became the order of the day in the post-Mauryan times. So, in the light of this, several historians started arguing that it could have been some kind of a Brahmanical reaction to what was an overtly unorthodox line of politics pursued by different Mauryan kings, noticeably Ashok. So, it was argued that since Ashok was very actively pursuing, he himself became a Bauddha practitioner, a Buddha, he himself was a Buddhist, and or transformed into a Buddhist post the Kalinga war, and gave up the Rana Vijay policy and rather took to Dhamma Vijay as the policy by declaring that from here on he would not resort to military conquest or killing of people in order to have acquisition over large area. Rather, he would try to win over people's heart, and that's what he called Dhamma Vijay. So, historians said that this kind of an attitude could have resulted into some kind of a pacifist approach of the Mauryan kings, and the military strength of the Mauryans could have been compromised with. And the fact that Ashok is also, through his Dhamma policy, is requesting people to pay equal respect to the Brahmins and the Shramanas. Shramanas standing for the ascetics, Buddhist as well as Jain. So, these historians say that this could have meant some kind of a pulling down of the stature of the Brahmins, because they were now supposed to be treated at par with Buddhist and Jain bhikshus, and this could have led to some kind of resentment amongst the Brahmins, and hence the Pushyamitra Shunga incident, where he, being a Brahmin, engineered the coup d'etat resulting into the demise of the Mauryan rule. So, this is the premise on which this particular argument is put across. But beyond this kind of writing, we also have several other historians, for that matter Romila Thapar and several others, who would argue that it was under the sheer pressure of constantly maintaining a very high revenue generation and keeping the state revenue at a very high level, because Kautilya's Arthashastra itself informs us about the elaborate mechanism of governance and bureaucracy, and even the payments, their salaries are mentioned, and they appear to be, from the contemporary standards, they appear to be reasonably high. So the officials, the military officials, were paid handsomely. The standing army entailed its own cost of maintenance. The huge retinue of elephants, horses, chariots, swords, armaments, they also required huge resources on part of the state to be invested in these pockets. And that could have meant that if there was some kind of a slackening, even for a short duration of time, then the kind of control which was the centerpiece of Mauryan Empire could have been compromised with. And this kind of an arrangement in these circumstances, archaic circumstances, those ancient times, it would not have been possible to continue maintaining that level of revenue generation for over a long period of time. So some historians say that it's rather a marvel that such kind of a mechanism could continue for 150 years, rather than saying that why could it be so short-lived. So this is the issue which comes to the fore when we start talking of the decline of Mauryan Empire. And it is believed, of course, Romila Thapar tries to absolve Ashok of the responsibility of bringing about the downfall of Mauryan Empire, because she says that despite pursuing the policy of non-violence and Dhamma, Ashok actually did not compromise with the strictness with which he was carrying out governance. And she cites that Atavika incident, which is referred to in one of the edicts, where Ashok comes out rather sternly against the forest dwellers and reprimands them that if they don't mend their ways, then harsh measures would follow. So it's not as if he is giving up the coercion, or he has become otherworldly, and therefore the sense of control which was exercised by the previous rulers of Mauryan Empire was not pursued by him. So this is the argument of Romila Thapar. Also true is the fact that despite having so much of love for Buddhism and the care that he took to propagate the policy of Dham, when he himself visits Lumbini, which is the birthplace of Gautam Buddha, in his own tenure, then we are informed that he does not make the people of Lumbini happy by foregoing the entire tax or revenue that was to be taken by the central government. So he reduces it, of course, but reduces it minimally, and that again tells us about the kind of pressure or the stress that Ashokan Empire must have been so far as revenue issue was concerned. And despite being a Buddhist, a practitioner Buddhist, Ashok could not forego the entire revenue from the birthplace of Gautam Buddha himself. So he is appearing to be rather aware of the necessity of maintaining strictness and going about the business as usual, despite the fact that he is very much actively into Dhamma Vijay, and he is propagating the policy of Dham through his officials and through his edicts, and trying to communicate with the people. So he is giving a twist to the state policy, no doubt. He is redefining kingship in Indian history and tradition, no doubt, but at the same time he is not being militarily slack or something of that. So at least we don't have direct reference to this. So this is how the issue of decline of the Mauryan Empire is debated amongst historians. So we have today tried to cover the leftover portions of the sources. We spoke of the nature of the Mauryan rule or nature of the Mauryan state as it exists in the historiography, in the current stage of historiography. We spoke of the centralization, decentralization debate, and finally we spoke of the different arguments related to the decline of the Mauryan Empire.
Thank you so much for talking to us about the Mauryas, and since we have a few minutes or so left, I would just like to pose a simple question to you, sir, asking when we talk about the Mauryan dynasty, and there are so many aspects, of course you have also mentioned within the lecture, there are so many ideas that come up, and within that I would like to ask you perhaps which are the most researched areas within this topic or aspect, and which are the areas which perhaps need more of attention, which the students have not looked at.
Thank you that you raised this issue. It's actually a very pertinent question to ask. The issues that we spoke of, for instance, the decline of Mauryan Empire, factors behind the decline of the Mauryan Empire, nature of the state, or for that matter, origin of the Mauryas, the social origin of the Mauryas, they are currently being debated on account of political reasons, from the point of view of gaining some kind of a legitimacy from these discourses that look, the Mauryans were not the Kshatriyas and they were of the low origin, and so some social groups would try to appropriate these issues to their own political advantage. So this is something which is happening, and we can see these things happening around in the politics of the present times. But in terms of the futuristic researches, of course, one is, as we mentioned, different social groups which existed in the Mauryan times. The Kumaras, the Kumara Mahamatyas, who were appointed, they were supposed to be the kin groups of the Mauryan family, but to what extent was the meritocratic bureaucracy in place? So these are the issues, and also very important are the environmental issues, the ecological data which can be used in order to understand the Mauryan times and the dynamics of the social and economic change, because whatever we argue in terms of narrative of the Mauryan Empire has to be consistent with the overall trajectory of the social and economic changes which were happening right from 6th century BC, and it continued in the post-Mauryan times.
Right.
So these are the issues which are currently debated upon.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for giving us such a wonderful insight into the whole topic. And with this, we would take your leave, but of course, again, sincerely thanking sir for being with us today. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
And thank you, viewers. Keep watching us. Have a wonderful day.